The sound of hooves echoed through the canyon as Fiona Calloway urged her paint mare up the narrow mountain trail, her heart hammering with worry over the missing goat that had wandered from her small herd that morning in the spring of 1878. She had raised Daisy from a kid, and the thought of losing her to a mountain lion or a fall made her chest tighten with anxiety as she scanned the rocky outcroppings above Buffalo, Wyoming, where the land turned wild and unforgiving. The morning sun beat down on her shoulders through her worn cotton dress, and she wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, squinting against the glare as she spotted a flash of white fur on a precarious ledge about 50 feet up the cliff face. "Daisy!" she called out, dismounting quickly and tying her mare to a scraggly pine. The goat bleated in response, her cry desperate and frightened. Fiona assessed the cliff, noting the natural handholds and the narrow path that seemed to lead upward. She had climbed these mountains since childhood, following her father on hunting trips before fever took him 2 winters past, leaving her and her mother to manage their small homestead alone. Her mother's rheumatism had worsened over the harsh winter, making Fiona the primary provider for their household, and losing even one goat meant losing milk, cheese, and potential income they desperately needed. She began her ascent, testing each foothold carefully, her worn boots finding purchase on the weathered stone. The wind picked up as she climbed higher, tugging at her long auburn hair that she had hastily braided that morning. Halfway up, she could see Daisy more clearly now, trapped on a narrow outcropping with no clear path forward or back, her yellow eyes wide with fear. "I'm coming, girl," Fiona called out, her voice steady despite the growing height beneath her. "Just stay still." She reached for another handhold, pulling herself up onto what appeared to be solid rock. The moment her full weight settled onto the ledge, she heard the sickening crack of stone giving way. Her stomach dropped as the entire section of cliff face began to crumble beneath her feet. She scrambled for purchase, her fingers scraping against crumbling rock, her boots sliding on loose scree. A scream tore from her throat as she felt herself falling backward into empty air. Then, suddenly, her descent stopped with a violent jerk that sent pain shooting through her shoulder. Strong fingers wrapped around her wrist like an iron band, and she looked up to see a man lying flat on a more stable section of the cliff above her, his other hand braced against a boulder, the muscles in his arms straining as he held her entire weight suspended over the drop. "I have got you," he said, his voice deep and calm despite the obvious effort it took to keep her from falling. "Do not move." Fiona hung there, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest, staring up at the stranger who had appeared from nowhere. He had long, dark hair that fell past his shoulders, tied back loosely with a strip of leather, and a thick beard that could not hide the strong line of his jaw. His eyes were an intense gray blue, focused entirely on her with a concentration that made her feel as though nothing else in the world existed for him in that moment, except keeping her alive. "Can you reach up with your other hand?" he asked, his voice strained now as he began pulling her upward with slow, controlled movements. The muscles in his forearms bulged beneath his rolled-up sleeves, tendons standing out in sharp relief. She swallowed hard and nodded, reaching up with her free hand. He caught it immediately, his palm rough with calluses but his grip secure. "On 3, I'm going to pull. Use your feet against the rock face if you can find any hold at all." 1, he counted, adjusting his position slightly. 2. She braced herself, her boots scraping against the cliff. 3. He pulled with such force that she rose several feet in one motion, and she kicked hard against a small protrusion, helping propel herself upward. He did not stop, his muscles bunching and releasing as he hauled her up hand over hand until she could get her elbows onto the ledge where he lay. With one final heave, he pulled her completely onto solid ground, and they both collapsed there for a moment, breathing hard. "Are you hurt?" he asked after a few seconds, pushing himself up to sit and looking her over with those intense eyes. Fiona shook her head, still trying to catch her breath, her hands trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. "No, I do not think so. Thank you. You saved my life." He nodded once, then stood with fluid grace despite the exertion he had just gone through, reaching down to help her to her feet. She took his hand and found herself pulled upright with such ease that it startled her. Standing, she could fully appreciate his size. He towered over her 5'5" frame by at least half a foot, and his shoulders were broad enough to block out the sun. He wore simple clothes, a homespun shirt and canvas pants held up by suspenders. but the way they fit him spoke of a body honed by hard mountain living. "What were you doing climbing up here?" he asked, and though his tone was not unkind, there was a note of reproach in it. "My goat," she said, pointing to where Daisy still bleated pitifully. "She wandered off this morning, and I cannot afford to lose her." He followed her gaze and sighed, a sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "Wait here." Before she could protest, he began climbing toward Daisy with a sureness that spoke of years navigating these mountains. He moved like water flowing over rock, finding holds she had not even noticed, his powerful frame somehow both graceful and commanding. Within minutes he had reached the goat, scooped her up as though she weighed nothing, and tucked her under one arm. The descent took longer, as he had to be careful with his burden, but soon he was back beside Fiona, setting Daisy down gently. The goat immediately tried to bolt, but Fiona caught her, checking her over for injuries. Finding none, she looked up at the stranger with gratitude shining in her green eyes. "I do not know how to thank you. For both of us. You can thank me by not climbing unstable cliff faces alone," he said, but there was a hint of warmth in his eyes now. "That section has been crumbling for months. I've been meaning to mark it as dangerous." "You live up here?" she asked, genuinely curious. She had never seen him in Buffalo, and she knew most of the faces in their small town. "I have a cabin about 2 miles north," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the higher peaks. "I trap and hunt, bring furs and meat down to trade once a month or so." "I am Fiona Calloway," she said, adjusting her grip on Daisy, who had finally stopped struggling. "Kane Jameson," he replied, and something in the way he said his name made her think he was not accustomed to introducing himself. They stood there for a moment in awkward silence, the wind whistling through the rocks around them. Finally, Fiona cleared her throat. "Would you help me get her down to my horse? I do not trust her not to run off again if I try to carry her myself." Kane nodded and took Daisy from her without waiting for permission, tucking the goat securely against his chest with one arm. "Lead the way." The descent was much easier than the climb had been, though Fiona found herself hyper-aware of Kane moving behind her, his presence somehow both comforting and unsettling. When they reached her mare, he held Daisy while Fiona fashioned a makeshift sling from rope she kept in her saddlebag, creating a secure carrier she could wear across her back. "That is clever," Kane observed as she settled the goat into place. "Necessity," Fiona said with a slight smile. "I've had to get creative over the years." "You live in Buffalo?" he asked, and she nodded. "On a homestead about a mile outside town. My mother and I raise goats and chickens, sell milk and eggs and cheese." Something flickered across his face at the mention of her mother, but it was gone before she could identify it. "No husband?" The question was blunt, and she felt heat rise to her cheeks. "No, no husband. It has been just my mother and me since my father died." He nodded slowly, processing this information. "The trail down can be treacherous with a loaded horse. I will walk with you until you reach the main road." "You do not have to do that," Fiona protested, though part of her hoped he would insist. "I know," he said simply, and began walking. She mounted her mare and followed, Daisy's weight familiar against her back. For a while they moved in silence, Kane's long strides eating up the ground, while her horse plodded along beside him. She found herself studying him when she thought he was not looking, noting the way his hair caught the sunlight in shades of deep brown and black, the easy way he navigated the terrain without seeming to pay attention, the breadth of his shoulders that spoke of countless hours of physical labor. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked finally, unable to bear the silence any longer. 5 years, he said, his eyes scanning the tree line constantly, always alert. "Came out west after the war, found I preferred the mountains to people." "The war," she repeated softly. So many men carried those scars, visible and invisible. "Were you with the Union or the Confederacy?" "Union," he said shortly, in a tone that suggested he did not want to discuss it further. She respected that, letting the silence fall again for a few minutes before trying a different approach. "What made you decide to help me today? You could have just let me fall." He stopped walking and turned to look at her, his expression serious. "I heard you call out to your goat, followed the sound and saw you climbing, recognized the section of cliff you were heading for and knew it was unstable, got there just as it gave way." "Lucky for me," she said softly. "Lucky," he agreed, resuming his walk. "Though I would call it foolish, climbing up there without proper equipment or someone to spot you." Fiona bristled at the criticism, even though she knew it was deserved. I did not have much choice. Like I said, I cannot afford to lose any animals." "Better to lose a goat than your life," Kane said bluntly. "Easy for you to say," she shot back, her temper flaring. "You are not trying to keep a homestead running with limited resources and a sick mother depending on you." He glanced at her, and she saw something soften in his expression. "You're right. I spoke without thinking. I apologize." The apology surprised her, deflating her anger immediately. In her experience, most men did not apologize to women, especially not for speaking their minds. "I appreciate that. And you are not wrong. It was reckless. I just worry, you know?" "I know," he said quietly, and something in his tone made her think he understood more than he was saying. They walked for another 20 minutes before the narrow trail widened into the main road that led to Buffalo. Kane stopped at the junction, looking down toward the town spread out in the valley below. "You will be safe from here," he said. Fiona dismounted, feeling strange about saying goodbye to this man who had saved her life, this stranger who somehow felt less like a stranger with every passing minute. "Thank you again, Kane. I truly do not know what would have happened if you had not been there." "You would have fallen," he said matter-of-factly. "Probably died." "You have a gift for stating the obvious," she said, but she was smiling as she said it. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "So I have been told." She hesitated, then reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a small wrapped package. "I made extra biscuits this morning. Take these. It's the least I can do." Kane looked at the offered package as though it were something foreign, and for a moment she thought he would refuse. Then he reached out and took it, his fingers brushing hers briefly, sending an unexpected jolt through her. "Thank you." "If you ever need anything," she said impulsively, "anything at all, our homestead is the one with the red barn about a mile east of town, the Calloway place." He nodded slowly, tucking the biscuits into the leather pack he wore slung across his back. "I will remember." Then he turned and began walking back up the trail, his powerful form moving with that same easy grace she had noticed before. Fiona stood there watching until he disappeared around a bend, then remounted her horse and headed for home, her mind full of gray-blue eyes and strong hands that had held her life in their grip. When she arrived at the homestead, her mother was sitting on the porch in a rocking chair, working on her knitting despite the swollen joints that made every movement painful. Margaret Calloway looked up as Fiona approached, her weathered face creasing with relief. "Thank the Lord," her mother said. "I was getting worried. Did you find Daisy?" "I found her," Fiona said, dismounting and carefully extracting the goat from her sling. "She was trapped on a cliff ledge. It was quite an adventure getting her down." Her mother's eyes narrowed, that maternal instinct that could detect trouble a mile away activating immediately. "What kind of adventure?" Fiona busied herself with unsaddling her horse, not meeting her mother's gaze. "The kind where I nearly fell to my death but was saved by a mountain man who happened to be nearby." "Fiona Mary Calloway!" Her mother set down her knitting with more force than necessary. "You tell me everything right now." So Fiona did, leaving out no details except perhaps the strange flutter she had felt when Kane's fingers brushed hers. Her mother listened with growing alarm, her face pale by the time Fiona finished. "You could have died," Margaret whispered, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for her daughter. "But I did not," Fiona said gently, kneeling beside her mother's chair and taking those swollen hands in her own. "Kane saved me, and he saved Daisy. We are both fine." "This Kane," her mother said slowly, her sharp mind already working. "Did he seem like a good man?" Fiona thought about that question, remembering the calm strength in his voice, the way he had apologized without hesitation, the gentleness with which he had handled Daisy despite his size. "Yes," she said finally. "I think he is." "Good," her mother said firmly. "Then we owe him a debt. We must repay it properly." Over the next few days, Fiona found her thoughts returning to Kane with surprising frequency. She thought about him while milking the goats, while churning butter, while collecting eggs from the chicken coop. She wondered what his cabin looked like, what he did with his days, whether he was lonely up there in the mountains by himself. The wondering bothered her, because she had never been one to daydream about men. She had always been too practical, too focused on survival to waste time on romantic fancies. But Kane was not a fancy. He was real, solid, undeniably present in her thoughts despite his physical absence. A week after the incident, she and her mother prepared a proper thank you gift. Fresh bread still warm from the oven, a wheel of their best cheese, a jar of preserves made from last summer's berries, and a thick wool blanket her mother had woven the previous winter. Fiona packed it all carefully into a basket, trying to ignore her mother's knowing looks. "I am just repaying a debt," Fiona insisted as she saddled her mare. "Of course you are, dear," her mother said, her tone entirely too innocent. "That is why you changed your dress 3 times this morning." Fiona felt her cheeks heat. "I did no such thing." "Whatever you say," her mother replied, returning to her knitting with a small smile. The ride up into the mountains felt longer than Fiona remembered, though that might have been because she was second-guessing herself with every step. What if Kane did not want visitors? What if he thought she was being forward or inappropriate? What if he was not even there? She found his cabin by following the directions he had given and by asking an old trapper she encountered on the trail. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, a sturdy structure built from hewn logs that spoke of skilled craftsmanship. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, and she could see a shed off to one side, probably for storing furs and equipment. A small garden plot had been cleared, though nothing was planted in it yet this early in spring. Fiona dismounted and stood there for a moment, gathering her courage. Before she could knock, the door opened, and Kane stood there, filling the doorway with his broad frame. He wore no shirt, and she tried very hard not to stare at the expanse of muscled chest and arms on display, at the scars that crisscrossed his torso, telling stories she could only imagine. "Fiona," he said, and she realized she liked the way her name sounded in his deep voice. "I am sorry," she said quickly, forcing her eyes to stay on his face. "I should have sent word I was coming. My mother and I wanted to thank you properly for what you did. I brought some things." He looked at the basket, then back at her, an unreadable expression on his face. "You did not have to do that." "We wanted to," she insisted, holding the basket out. "Please. It would mean a lot to my mother to know you accepted it." That seemed to decide him. He took the basket, his fingers brushing hers again, and that same jolt went through her. "Thank you. Would you like to come in?" She knew she should say no. It was not proper for an unmarried woman to enter a bachelor's home. But propriety had never been Fiona's strongest suit, and she found herself nodding before she could think better of it. The cabin's interior was surprisingly well kept, everything in its place. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a fire burning low in the hearth. A simple table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room, and she could see a bed in one corner, neatly made. Furs hung on one wall, obviously being prepared for trade. A few books sat on a shelf, their spines worn with use. "You read," she observed, moving closer to examine the titles. "When I can get books," Kane said, setting the basket on the table. He had disappeared for a moment and returned wearing a shirt, though he had not bothered to button it completely. "The selection in Buffalo is limited." "What do you like to read?" she asked, genuinely curious. "History mostly, some philosophy, anything that helps me understand why people do what they do." "Have you figured it out yet?" she asked with a slight smile. "No," he admitted, and she thought she saw the ghost of a smile cross his own face. "But I keep trying." He unpacked the basket, examining each item with what seemed like genuine appreciation. When he reached the blanket, he ran his hand over it, feeling the quality of the weaving. "Your mother made this?" "She did. Before the rheumatism got so bad, she does not weave much anymore, but she wanted you to have one of her best pieces." "It is beautiful work," he said softly. "Please tell her I said so." "You could tell her yourself," Fiona said impulsively. "Come to dinner tomorrow night. Let her thank you in person." Kane looked up sharply, surprise evident in his eyes. "I do not think that is a good idea." "Why not?" she challenged, crossing her arms. "Are you afraid of homestead cooking?" "I'm not afraid of anything," he said, a hint of steel entering his voice. "Then prove it. Come to dinner." They stared at each other for a long moment, and Fiona saw the exact instant he gave in. "What time?" 6 o'clock, she said, trying not to show how pleased she was that he had agreed. "And Kane? My mother does not stand on ceremony. Wear whatever you are comfortable in." He walked her out to her horse, and as she mounted, he placed one large hand on her mare's neck, looking up at her. "Thank you for the gifts. You did not have to go to such trouble." "It was no trouble," she said honestly. I will see you tomorrow." She rode away, feeling his eyes on her until the trees swallowed her from view. The next day passed in a flurry of activity as Fiona and her mother prepared for their guest. They cleaned the house until it shone, picked wildflowers to put on the table, and cooked enough food to feed a small army. Margaret insisted on making her famous pot roast, along with fresh bread, roasted vegetables, and an apple pie that made Fiona's mouth water just smelling it. "You are going to a lot of trouble for a simple thank-you dinner," Fiona observed, kneading dough for the bread. "A man who saves my daughter's life deserves more than a simple dinner," her mother replied firmly. "Besides, I want to get a proper look at him, see what kind of man he really is." "He is just a mountain man, Mama. Do not read too much into this." Her mother gave her a look that said she saw right through that protestation, but mercifully said nothing more. Kane arrived exactly at 6, riding a magnificent buckskin stallion that immediately drew Fiona's admiration. He had cleaned up, his long hair still damp and neatly tied back, his beard trimmed. He wore what were obviously his best clothes, a clean shirt and pants that were free of patches, though still the simple garments of a working man. In his hands he carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Mr. Jameson," Margaret said warmly, coming out onto the porch despite the difficulty of the steps. "Welcome to our home." Kane dismounted and approached, ducking his head respectfully. "Mrs. Calloway, thank you for inviting me. I brought something for you." He held out the bundle. Margaret unwrapped it carefully, revealing a beautiful fox pelt, the fur thick and lustrous. "Oh my," she breathed. "This is exquisite." "I thought you might be able to use it for a winter wrap or trim for a coat," Kane said, looking almost shy. "The fur's very warm." "It is perfect," Margaret said, tears gleaming in her eyes. "And you did not have to bring anything, young man. We owe you everything for saving my Fiona." "I only did what anyone would do," Kane said, but Fiona could see the faint color rising in his cheeks at the praise. "Nonsense," Margaret said briskly. "Now come inside and sit down. Dinner is almost ready." The meal was one of the most pleasant Fiona could remember in a long time. Kane was quiet at first, clearly not used to social situations, but her mother had a gift for putting people at ease. She asked him questions about his life in the mountains, his trapping, the wildlife he encountered, and he gradually relaxed, his answers becoming longer and more detailed. Fiona watched him as he talked, noting the way his eyes lit up when he discussed the mountains, the deep love he obviously had for the wilderness. She saw her mother watching him too, but with a different intent, evaluating him in that way mothers had of determining whether someone was good enough for their children. "You said you came west after the war," Margaret said gently as they finished the main course. "Do you have family back east?" Something closed off in Kane's expression. "No family. They're all gone." "I'm sorry," Margaret said with genuine sympathy. "We know what it is like to lose people. Fiona's father passed 2 years ago. It has been hard, but we manage." Kane looked at Fiona, and she saw understanding in his eyes, the recognition of shared grief. "My father and brother died in the war. My mother passed not long after from heartbreak. There was nothing left for me there, so I headed west and kept going until I found a place that felt right." "And did you find it?" Fiona asked softly. "A place that feels right?" He was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "The mountains are as close as I have come. They do not judge, do not demand anything except respect. I like that." "But do not you get lonely?" Margaret asked, voicing the question Fiona had been thinking. "Sometimes," he admitted, his honesty surprising all of them, probably including himself. "But loneliness is better than the alternative." "What alternative?" Fiona asked. "Letting people close and then losing them," Kane said, his voice rough. "I have lost everyone I ever cared about. Easier not to care." The bleakness in his tone made Fiona's heart ache. She reached across the table without thinking and placed her hand over his, feeling the calloused warmth of his skin. "That is no way to live." He looked down at her hand on his, and for a moment she thought he might pull away. Instead, he turned his hand over so their palms touched, his fingers curling gently around hers. "Maybe not, but it is safe." "Safe is not the same as happy," Margaret observed quietly. Kane did not respond to that, but he also did not let go of Fiona's hand, and she did not pull away. They sat like that for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Finally, Margaret cleared her throat gently. Who would like pie? The rest of the evening passed with lighter conversation, and by the time Kane prepared to leave, the tension had eased. He stood on the porch with both women, his horse waiting patiently nearby. Thank you for dinner, he said formally. It was the best meal I have had in years. You are welcome any time, Margaret said firmly. And I mean that. Do not be a stranger, Kane. He nodded, then looked at Fiona. Walk me to my horse? She did, acutely aware of her mother's eyes on them from the porch. When they reached his stallion, Kane turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. Your mother is a good woman, he said. She likes you, Fiona replied. I can tell. And you? The question was quiet, almost hesitant. Do you like me? Fiona felt her heart begin to race. I barely know you. That was not what I asked. She took a breath, deciding to be as honest as he'd been at dinner. Yes, I like you. I have been thinking about you since the day you saved me. Something flared in his eyes, an emotion she could not quite name. I have been thinking about you too, more than I should. Why should you not think about me? She asked, moving a step closer. Because I have nothing to offer a woman like you, he said bluntly. I live alone in the mountains. I have no prospects beyond subsistence living. You deserve better than that. Shouldn't I be the one to decide what I deserve? She challenged. Fiona, he said, and her name was almost a groan. You do not understand. I am not good at this. I have been alone for so long, I do not know how to be with people anymore. I do not know if I remember how to let someone matter to me. She reached up without thinking and placed her palm against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath his shirt. Then maybe it is time you learned again. He covered her hand with his own, his touch gentle despite his size. I will hurt you. Not intentionally, but I will. I am bound to. Everyone gets hurt, she said softly. That is part of living. But I would rather live and risk hurt than be safe and alone. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the war being waged behind his eyes, the desire to protect himself from more loss, battling against something else, something that might have been hope. Finally, he lifted her hand from his chest and brought it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent warmth flooding through her entire body. I should go, he said, but he did not release her hand. Will you come back? She asked, not caring that she sounded desperate. Yes, he said simply, if you want me to. I do, she whispered. He held her gaze for another heartbeat, then released her hand and swung up onto his horse. Good night, Fiona. Good night, Kane. She watched him ride away, standing there until the sound of hooves faded completely. When she turned back to the house, her mother was still on the porch, a knowing smile on her face. That's a good man, Margaret said as Fiona climbed the steps. I know, Fiona replied. And you are falling for him. It was not a question, but Fiona answered anyway. Yes, I think I am. Good, her mother said, taking her arm as they went inside. He needs someone like you, and you need someone like him, whether you know it yet or not. Over the following weeks, Kane became a regular presence at the Calloway homestead. He would arrive in the late afternoon, always with something to offer, fresh meat from his hunting, furs that could be sold at market, his strong back and capable hands to help with repairs that Fiona and her mother could not manage alone. He fixed their barn door, which had been hanging crooked for months. He reinforced the chicken coop against predators. He helped Fiona build a new fence for the goat pen, working alongside her with easy competence. They talked while they worked, conversations that ranged from the mundane to the profound. She learned that he had been a scout during the war, that his skills in the wilderness had kept many soldiers alive. She learned that he loved poetry, but would never admit it to anyone but her. She learned that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh when she least expected it. He learned that she had wanted to be a teacher before her father died, that she loved books as much as he did. He learned that she was terrified of thunderstorms but would never show it. He learned that she sang while she worked, old ballads her father had taught her, and that her voice was one of the most beautiful things he had ever heard. Slowly, carefully, like two wild animals learning to trust, they drew closer to each other. One warm afternoon in late May, They were working together to clear rocks from a field Margaret wanted to plant with vegetables. It was hot work, and Kane had removed his shirt, working in just his pants and boots. Fiona tried not to stare at the play of muscles across his back and shoulders, at the way sweat gleamed on his skin in the sunlight, but she found her eyes drawn to him again and again. "You are staring," he said without looking up, amusement in his voice. She felt heat flood her cheeks. "I am not." "You are," he insisted, finally turning to face her with a grin that transformed his usually serious face. "I do not mind." "You are insufferable," she said, but she was smiling as she said it. He walked over to where she stood, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "And you are beautiful." Her breath caught at the simple declaration. "Kane." "It is the truth," he said, reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "I have wanted to tell you for weeks now, but the words never seemed right. You are beautiful, Fiona, inside and out." "You are not so bad yourself," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, really smiled, his whole face softening. Then, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head and kissed her. His lips were soft despite the roughness of his beard, gentle in a way that made her heart ache. She reached up and wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, kissing him back with all the longing that had been building inside her since the day he had caught her wrist on that crumbling cliff. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I am falling in love with you," he said quietly. "I have been trying not to, but I cannot help it." "Then do not try to help it," she said, joy bubbling up inside her, "because I am falling in love with you too." He kissed her again, deeper this time, his arms coming around her and lifting her clean off her feet. She laughed against his mouth and he spun her around, both of them grinning like fools when he finally set her down. From the porch, Margaret watched with tears in her eyes and a smile on her face, grateful that her daughter had found someone to share her life with, someone strong enough to stand beside her and gentle enough to hold her heart carefully. As summer settled over Wyoming, Kane and Fiona's relationship deepened. He still spent most of his time at his cabin, but he came down to the homestead nearly every day, and on the occasions when Fiona could spare the time, she rode up to visit him in the mountains. She loved his cabin, the quiet peace of it, the way the world seemed far away up there among the pines. They would sit on the porch he had built facing the valley, watching the sunset over the mountains, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. They talked about everything and nothing. He told her stories of his scouting days, the close calls, and the men he had served with. She told him about her childhood, about the dreams she had set aside when her father died. "You could still teach," Kane said one evening as they sat together. "There's a schoolhouse in Buffalo. They are always looking for teachers." "I could not leave my mother alone to manage the homestead," Fiona said, though she felt a pang of longing at the thought. "What if she was not alone?" Kane asked carefully. "What if there was someone to help her?" Fiona pulled back to look at him, her heart beginning to race. "What are you saying?" He took both her hands in his expression serious. "I am saying that I love you, Fiona. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. And I know I do not have much to offer, just a cabin in the mountains and a life that is not easy, but I can work hard, I can provide, I can take care of you and your mother if you will let me." "Kane," she breathed, tears springing to her eyes. I am asking you to marry me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know it is soon, and I know you could probably do better than a mountain man with nothing but calloused hands and a scarred heart. But I swear to you, Fiona, I will spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you never regret saying yes." "Yes," she said immediately, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, of course, yes." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe, and she did not care. "I will make you happy," he promised against her hair. "I swear it." "You already do," she whispered back. They were married in early July in a simple ceremony at the small church in Buffalo. Margaret cried through the entire service, and the few townspeople who had become friends with Fiona and her mother attended to wish them well. Kane stood at the altar looking uncomfortable in borrowed formal clothes, but when Fiona walked down the aisle in the simple white dress her mother had helped her sew, his face transformed with such love and awe that several women in attendance found themselves reaching for handkerchiefs. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and when Kane kissed his bride, it was with a tenderness that made Margaret sob even harder. Afterward, they had a small celebration at the homestead, with food and music and dancing. Kane was stiff and awkward at first, clearly not used to being the center of attention, but Fiona coaxed him into dancing with her, and soon he relaxed, holding her close as they swayed to the fiddle music. "Are you happy?" he asked her as they danced. "Happier than I have ever been," she said honestly, looking up into his gray-blue eyes. "Good," he said, kissing her forehead. "That is all I want, to make you happy." They had agreed that they would continue living at the homestead, rather than Kane's cabin, at least for now while Margaret needed help. Kane had already moved most of his belongings down from the mountains, consolidating his trapping operation to be closer to his new family. He would still need to spend time in the high country during trapping season, but he could do most of his work in the foothills near Buffalo. Their wedding night was spent in the small bedroom that had been Fiona's since childhood, now transformed into a space for both of them. Kane was gentle and patient, taking his time to learn what brought her pleasure, murmuring words of love and praise against her skin. She discovered the scars that covered his body, each one a story of survival, and kissed every one she could reach. They came together with a passion that left them both breathless, and afterward, lying tangled in each other's arms, Fiona thought she had never felt more complete. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Kane replied, his arms tightening around her. "More than words can say." Life settled into a new rhythm. Kane threw himself into improving the homestead with the same single-minded determination he brought to everything. He expanded the barn, built a new smokehouse, cleared more land for planting. He taught Fiona better techniques for hunting and trapping, skills she took to with surprising aptitude. She taught him to read more complex texts, introducing him to novels and poetry that made his eyes light up with the joy of discovery. Margaret flourished with Kane's presence, her health improving with the reduced stress and increased help. She adored her new son-in-law, who treated her with unfailing respect and gentleness, always making sure she had what she needed, always taking time to sit with her on the porch and listen to her stories. Autumn came, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Kane prepared for trapping season, and though Fiona hated the thought of him being gone for days at a time, she understood it was necessary. The money from furs would help them expand the homestead, maybe hire some help so Fiona could eventually pursue her dream of teaching. The first time he left, she clung to him longer than necessary, breathing in the scent of him, pine and leather and something uniquely Kane. "I will be back in 5 days," he promised, cupping her face in his hands, "and I will be careful, I promise." "You had better be," she said fiercely, "because if something happens to you, I will march up into those mountains and drag you back myself." He smiled and kissed her thoroughly. "I believe you would." The 5 days felt like 5 years, but he returned exactly when he promised, his horse loaded with furs and his arms eager to hold his wife. They made love that night with a desperation born of separation, reaffirming their connection with bodies and whispered words. As winter approached, they discovered that Fiona was pregnant. She told Kane one evening after dinner, her heart in her throat, not sure how he would react. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and she felt fear begin to creep in. Then, suddenly, he let out a whoop of joy that startled both her and Margaret, scooped Fiona up in his arms, and spun her around the kitchen. "We are going to have a baby," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "A baby?" "Yes," she said, laughing at his reaction. "In the spring, the doctor thinks." He set her down carefully, then dropped to his knees in front of her, placing his large hands gently on her still flat stomach. "Hello, little one," he said softly. "I'm your papa. I promise to protect you and love you every day of your life." Fiona ran her fingers through his long hair, her heart so full she thought it might burst. This man, this strong, scarred, beautiful man who had saved her life in more ways than one, was going to be the father of her child. Margaret cried again, of course, happy tears this time as she embraced them both. "James would have been so proud," she said, speaking of Fiona's father, "so very proud." Winter was harsh that year, with heavy snows that isolated them for days at a time, but inside their home there was warmth and love and laughter. Kane made sure they had plenty of firewood, plenty of food stored away. He hovered over Fiona like a concerned bear, not letting her lift anything heavy, insisting she rest more than she thought necessary. She protested at first, independent woman that she was, but eventually gave in, touched by his protectiveness. On evenings when the wind howled outside, they would sit by the fire, Kane reading aloud to Fiona and Margaret from the books he had collected over the years. His deep voice brought the stories to life, and Fiona would rest her head on his shoulder, his hand on her growing belly, feeling their child move under his palm. "Do you hope for a boy or a girl?" she asked him one such evening. "I do not care," he said honestly. "As long as the baby is healthy and you are safe, nothing else matters." "But if you had to choose?" she pressed. He was quiet for a moment, thinking. "A girl," he said finally. "A little girl who looks just like you, with green eyes and auburn hair and your stubborn chin." "My chin is not stubborn," Fiona protested. "It absolutely is," he said, dropping a kiss on the top of her head. "And I love it." Spring arrived slowly, the snow melting to reveal the green world beneath. Fiona's belly had grown round and full, and Kane watched her with such love and concern that it sometimes made her laugh. He had already built a beautiful cradle, the wood smooth and perfectly joined, ready for their child. In late April, Fiona's labor began in the middle of the night. Kane woke instantly to her gasp of pain, his military training making him alert immediately. He helped her through the early stages, timing contractions, while Margaret prepared the bedroom and sent one of their hired hands to fetch the doctor from town. The labor was long and difficult. Kane held Fiona's hand through it all, letting her squeeze until his fingers went numb, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement and love. When she screamed with pain, he looked like he wanted to tear the world apart to make it stop. Margaret had to remind him several times that this was normal, that Fiona was strong, that she would get through it. Finally, as the sun rose on a beautiful spring morning, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that made Kane's eyes fill with tears. The doctor cleaned the baby and handed him to Fiona, who cradled him against her chest with shaking arms, exhausted but radiant. "A boy," she whispered, looking down at the red, wrinkled face of their child. "We have a son, Kane." Kane reached out with one large hand, gently touching the baby's tiny fist. The infant immediately grasped his father's finger, holding on with surprising strength. "Hello, son," Kane said, his voice breaking. "I am your papa." "What should we name him?" Fiona asked, looking up at her husband. Kane thought for a moment, then said softly, "James, after your father, if that is all right with you." Fresh tears spilled down Fiona's cheeks. "That's perfect." Margaret, who had been standing quietly in the corner, let out a sob and came forward to meet her grandson. "James Marcus Jameson," she said, using Fiona's father's middle name. "Welcome to the family, little one." The first months with a baby were exhausting but filled with joy. Kane proved to be a devoted father, getting up for late-night feedings, changing diapers without complaint, spending hours just holding his son and staring at him with wonder. Fiona would often find him in the middle of the night, sitting in the rocking chair he had built, James cradled in his arms, singing soft lullabies in his deep voice. "I never thought I would have this," he told her one such night when he caught her watching from the doorway. "A family, a home. I thought I had used up all my chances at happiness." She came to him, placing her hand on his shoulder, looking down at their sleeping son. "We all get second chances if we are brave enough to take them." "I am glad you were brave enough to climb that cliff," he said, looking up at her with such love that it took her breath away. "Even if it was foolish and dangerous and nearly stopped my heart when I saw you falling. I am glad you were there to catch me," she said, leaning down to kiss him, "in every way that matters." As James grew from infant to toddler, the homestead thrived. Kane's hard work and Fiona's practical management combined to make their small operation more profitable than it had ever been. They hired more help, expanded their herds, and began selling their goods at markets in larger towns. Margaret's health continued to improve, and she took great joy in her grandson, spoiling him shamelessly whenever she got the chance. When James was 2, Fiona approached Kane with an idea she had been thinking about for months. "The town needs a school teacher," she said one evening after James had been put to bed. Mrs. Henderson is retiring, and they have been trying to find someone to replace her. You want to teach, Kane said, understanding immediately. I do, she admitted. I know it would mean being away from home during the day, but with you and Mama here, and the hired hands helping, I think we could manage it. And Kane, I miss teaching. I miss working with children, helping them learn. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. Then you should do it. We will make it work. You're sure? She asked, pulling back to look at his face. It will mean changes to our routine. I am sure, he said firmly. You gave up your dream once. I will not let you give it up again. Besides, James should have a mother who is fulfilled and happy, not one who sacrificed everything for everyone else. So Fiona became the teacher at Buffalo's small schoolhouse, and she loved it. She taught reading and writing and arithmetic to children ranging in age from 6 to 14, and she was good at it. The parents praised her patience and skill, and the children adored her. Ken would sometimes stop by with James to walk her home at the end of the day, and her students would whisper and giggle about the big mountain man who looked so fierce but was so gentle with his wife and son. Life was good. Better than good. Fiona had her teaching, her family, her home. Kane had work he found meaningful, a wife he adored, a son who thought he hung the moon. Margaret lived to see her grandson start school, watching with pride as Fiona taught him his letters. But nothing good lasts forever without challenge. In the summer when James was 4, tragedy struck. Margaret suffered a sudden heart attack one warm evening, collapsing in the garden she loved. Fiona and Kane rushed her inside, sent for the doctor, but it was too late. She died peacefully in her sleep that night, Fiona holding one hand and Kane holding the other, with James sleeping unaware in his room. Fiona was devastated. Her mother had been her rock, her constant support through every difficulty. Kane held her through the grief, let her cry until she had no tears left, took care of James when she could not find the strength. At the funeral, he stood beside her like a bulwark against the storm, his presence the only thing keeping her from falling apart completely. She loved you, Kane told her that night as they lay in bed, Fiona curled against his chest. She told me once that she was grateful every day that you had found someone to love you the way you deserved. I miss her so much, Fiona whispered. I know. I miss her too. But she's at peace now, Fiona. No more pain, no more worry. And she knew before she died that you were happy and taken care of. That is all any parent wants for their child. Slowly, painfully, Fiona began to heal. The homestead felt emptier without Margaret's presence, but they carried on, as Margaret would have wanted them to. Kane took over more of the household duties so Fiona could continue teaching. James, too young to fully understand death, asked when Grandma was coming back, and they explained as gently as they could that she was in heaven now with his grandfather, watching over them all. 2 years after Margaret's death, Fiona discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy felt different, harder on her body than the first had been. Kane worried constantly, hovering even more than before, until she finally had to sit him down and tell him firmly that she was fine, the baby was fine, and he needed to trust that. Their daughter was born on a cold November night, coming faster than James had, her arrival almost too quick for the doctor to make it in time. Kane delivered his own daughter with Fiona guiding him through it, his hands steady despite his fear. When he caught his daughter and heard her first cry, he looked at Fiona with such awe and love that she started crying too. We have a daughter, he said, his voice full of wonder. A little girl. We do, Fiona said, exhausted but happy. What should we name her? Margaret, Kane said without hesitation. After your mother, if you want. Margaret Rose, Fiona said, thinking of her mother's favorite flowers. Maggie for short. Kane placed their daughter in Fiona's arms, then gathered them both close, with James climbing up on the bed to meet his baby sister. My girls, Kane said softly, looking at his family. My beautiful girls. Maggie proved to be as spirited as her namesake, a bundle of energy and curiosity from the moment she could crawl. She had Kane's gray-blue eyes and Fiona's auburn hair, and she wrapped her father around her tiny finger from day one. Kane, the fierce mountain man who could take down a bear with his bare hands, was utterly defenseless against his daughter's smiles. When Maggie was 2 and James was 8, Fiona finally convinced Kane to agree to something she had been suggesting for years. They expanded the cabin he had built all those years ago, turning it into a true mountain retreat where they could spend summers as a family. It took 2 years of work, done in stages, but when it was finished, it was perfect. Large enough to accommodate their growing family, with a wide porch that overlooked the valley and mountains beyond, it became their sanctuary. They would spend weeks at a time up there during the summer months, fishing in the nearby streams, hiking through the forests, teaching the children about the wilderness Kane loved so much. James took to the mountains like he had been born to them, learning tracking and hunting from his father with eager intensity. Maggie preferred collecting wildflowers and trying to befriend every animal she encountered, much to her parents' amusement and occasional concern. "She is fearless," Kane said one afternoon, watching Maggie try to approach a young deer. "It is terrifying." "She gets that from you," Fiona replied, leaning against him. "No," Kane said seriously. "She gets it from you. You climbed a crumbling cliff for a goat, remember?" "Fair point," Fiona conceded with a laugh. As the years passed, their love only deepened. They had weathered storms together, literal and metaphorical. They had built a life from nothing, creating a family and a home that was filled with love and laughter. Kane never lost his protectiveness, his need to keep his family safe, but he had learned to balance it with trust in their strength. Fiona continued teaching until James and Maggie were both in school, then decided to focus on running the homestead and helping Kane with his expanding fur trading business. They had become modestly prosperous, able to hire permanent help and even purchase additional land. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Kane surprised Fiona by taking her back to the spot where they had first met, where the cliff had crumbled and he had caught her wrist. Someone had placed a marker there warning of unstable ground, and Kane smiled when he saw it. "I told you I was going to mark it as dangerous," he said. "Only took you 10 years, Fiona teased. He pulled her close, looking down at her with the same intensity he had shown the day he saved her life. "Best thing that ever happened to me, catching you that day." "Best thing that ever happened to me, falling," she replied, reaching up to cup his bearded face. "I found everything I was looking for when I fell, even if I did not know I was looking for it." "I love you," he said, the words still holding the weight and truth they had held the first time he spoke them. "More now than ever, more than I thought possible." "I love you too," she whispered. "My mountain man, my hero, my husband." He kissed her there on that mountain trail, with the wind whispering through the pines and the sun warm on their faces, and Fiona thought about how strange and wonderful life was, how a single moment, a crumbling cliff and a strong hand catching hers, had changed everything. They returned home to find their children had conspired with the hired hands to prepare a surprise anniversary dinner. The table was laden with food. Flowers decorated every surface, and James and Maggie stood grinning, proud of their secret keeping. As they sat down together as a family, Kane reached under the table and took Fiona's hand, squeezing gently. She squeezed back, a silent conversation passing between them, a reaffirmation of everything they had built together. Years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges, as they always did. James grew into a young man who was the image of his father, strong and capable and kind. He decided to follow in Kane's footsteps, learning the fur trading business and eventually taking it over so Kane could slow down. Maggie inherited her mother's love of teaching and her father's love of the wilderness, eventually becoming a teacher like her mother, but specializing in natural sciences, taking her students on expeditions into the mountains. Kane's long hair had begun to turn silver at the temples, but he was still as strong as ever, still as protective of his family. Fiona found laugh lines appearing around her eyes, but she wore them proudly, each one a marker of happy years. They still took trips up to their mountain cabin, now sometimes bringing grandchildren when James married and started his own family. On a warm summer evening, when Kane was 60 and Fiona 57, they sat on the porch of their mountain cabin, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Their grandchildren were inside with Maggie, who had come up for a visit, their laughter drifting through the open windows. "Do you ever regret it?" Kane asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Regret what?" Fiona asked, though she suspected she knew what he meant. "Marrying me. The life we built. I know it was not easy, especially in the early years. I know you had dreams I could not give you." She turned to look at him, this man who had saved her life and then made it worth living, and smiled. "I have never regretted a single moment, not one. You gave me a life I never imagined I could have. Love I never thought I would find. You gave me our children, our grandchildren. You gave me everything that matters. You gave me the same, he said, pulling her close against his side. I was lost before I found you. Just surviving, not living. You taught me how to live again, how to hope, how to love. They sat there as the sun sank below the mountains, holding each other as they had held each other through countless sunsets over the years. Inside, they could hear their daughter reading to the grandchildren, James's voice calling out something that made everyone laugh. We did good, Kane said softly. We did, Fiona agreed. We did very good. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they remained there. Two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built a love that had weathered every storm. A woman searching for a goat, a cliff that crumbled, a strong hand that caught her and never let go. It had all started with a fall and a catch, but it had become so much more. A marriage, a family, a life rich with love and meaning. And as they sat there surrounded by the mountains Kane loved and the family Fiona had always wanted, they knew that every choice, every moment, every struggle had been worth it. The legacy they built continued long after they were gone. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would tell the story of how Kane and Fiona met, of the crumbling cliff and the mountain man who saved the woman who would become his wife. It became family legend, passed down through generations, a reminder that love often comes when we least expect it, that the best things in life are worth fighting for, and that sometimes falling is exactly what we need to do to find where we truly belong. The homestead remained in the family, as did the mountain cabin. James expanded the fur trading business into a general mercantile that served Buffalo and surrounding towns for generations. Maggie's work in natural sciences earned recognition beyond Wyoming, but she always returned to the mountains that had shaped her childhood. Both children raised their own families with the values Kane and Fiona had instilled in them, passing down stories and lessons learned at their parents' knees. Kane lived to be 74, still strong and vital, until a sudden illness took him quickly one winter. He died at home, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, with Fiona holding his hand just as she had held her mother's all those years ago. His last words were, "I love you," spoken to his wife, and he went peacefully, a slight smile on his face. Fiona lived another 3 years, spending her days working in the garden she had expanded over the years, teaching her great-grandchildren their letters, and visiting the mountain cabin where she could still feel Kane's presence in every beam and board. She never remarried, never even considered it. Kane had been the love of her life, the one great romance, and she was content to live on memories until she could join him again. She died in her sleep on a spring morning, much like the one when she had first given birth to James. The family found her in her bed, peaceful and serene, a letter to her children on the nightstand. In it, she had written about her life, about the day Kane had saved her from the crumbling cliff, about their courtship and marriage, and all the years that followed. She wrote about loss and love, about the importance of family, about taking chances even when they seem foolish. The letter ended with these words, "If I have learned anything in my years on this earth, it is that love is worth the risk. Always. Do not be afraid to fall, my darlings, because you never know who might be there to catch you. And when someone catches you, hold on tight and never let go. Your father caught me that day on the mountain, but the truth is, we spent the rest of our lives catching each other over and over again. That is what love is. That is what marriage is. Catching each other when we fall, and falling, knowing we will be caught. I go now to be with your father once more, and I go without regret, without fear, only with gratitude for the beautiful life we built together. Love always, with all my heart, your mother." They buried her next to Kane under a sprawling oak tree on the homestead, with a view of the mountains they had both loved so much. The entire town of Buffalo turned out for the funeral, testifying to the impact Fiona had made as a teacher and community member. Her children and grandchildren spoke, telling stories that made people laugh and cry, painting a picture of a woman who had been strong and kind and brave. And sometimes, on quiet summer evenings, people swear they can see two figures sitting on the porch of the old Jameson cabin up in the mountains. A broad-shouldered man with long hair and a woman with auburn hair going gray, sitting close together, watching the sunset. Just shadows and light, probably. Tricks of the eye. But those who believe in love that transcends death like to think it is Kane and Fiona, still together, still watching over the family they created and the land they loved. The cliff where they met became something of a landmark. James eventually placed a proper memorial there, a stone marker with an inscription that read, "Here a cliff crumbled. Here a hand reached out. Here a love began that would last forever. Kane and Fiona Jameson." Young couples would sometimes hike up to see it, touching the stone for luck, hoping their own love would prove as enduring. The story became part of Buffalo's history, told and retold, growing slightly with each telling as stories do, but never losing its essential truth. A woman in danger, a man who saved her, and the love that grew from a moment of crisis into something lasting and profound. It reminded people that heroes were not just in stories, that true love was possible, that lives could change in an instant if you were brave enough to reach out. And somewhere, in whatever place souls go when they leave this world, Kane and Fiona are together still, their hands clasped tight, their love unbroken by death or time or distance. He is still her mountain man, strong and protective and wholly devoted. She is still his fierce, beautiful wife who climbed a cliff for a goat and fell into his arms and his heart. They are still falling, still catching each other, still building their forever one day at a time. The legacy of their love remains in the faces of their descendants, in the homestead that still bears their name, in the mountain cabin where families still gather in summer. It remains in the stories told around fires, in the memorial stone on the mountain, in the way Buffalo remembers the mountain man and the teacher who showed everyone what love could be when two people were brave enough to fight for it. And if you listen carefully on a summer night in Wyoming, when the wind whispers through the pines and the stars shine bright over the mountains, you might hear echoes of their laughter, see shadows of their embrace, feel the warmth of a love that refused to be confined by something as simple as mortality. Because some loves are too strong to end, too true to fade, too profound to be forgotten. Kane and Fiona's love was one of those. A love born on a crumbling cliff, sustained through years of joy and sorrow, strengthened by every challenge they faced together. A love that became the foundation for generations, the example by which all other loves in their family would be measured. A love that started with a fall and a catch and lasted far beyond the bounds of any single lifetime, echoing on into eternity, a testament to the power of two people who chose each other and kept choosing each other every single day. And that, really, is all any love story needs to be. A choice made again and again, in big moments and small ones, in crisis and in calm, in youth and in age. Kane chose to catch Fiona when she fell. Fiona chose to let him. And then they chose each other, over and over, for the rest of their lives and beyond. That is the story. That is the legacy. That is love.